Hi everyone, my name is Hansel Krankenpansen, and my talk for today is What a Crock, Economic Theory and Distributional Issues. Let me explain that title a little bit. The theory I'm talking about is good old-fashioned, traditional, neoclassical microeconomic theory. You may remember this theory from such classes as Economics 101. If you want to get specific, I'll be talking about the so-called welfare economics component of economic theory, which is the bit that discusses what we should do if we want socially optimal outcomes, which does sound pretty good. Distributional issues just means issues about who gets what. It's a very fundamental aspect of every economic system. This is a crock. It's an earthenware vessel. But it can also mean a bit of nonsense. And that's actually the definition I have in mind here. So that's what I'd like to address today. Basically, I'd like to debunk or take the crock out of discussions of distributional issues by explaining what economic theory has to do with it, or doesn't have to do with it, more like. Before you get your rage on, let me just say, I'm not going to resolve disagreements about distributional issues. I might mention a few things to think about at the end of the talk, but that's about it. All I'm trying to do is improve how we discuss distributional issues. A quick word on organization. I've arranged my talk in 16 units of varying lengths, and you might want to just try to get through them all in one go, because they are interrelated to a certain degree. But if you just can't stand that much economics in one sitting, and you prefer doing only one or two sections at a time, that should also work. Our first topic is utility. The ostensible goal of the theory of welfare economics is to maximize utility. That's how it defines a socially optimal outcome. That brings up an interesting question. What is utility? Okay, that sounds like a no-brainer. Happiness, satisfaction, something like that. But you know what they say. Appearances can be misleading. Scratch the surface and you'll see it's not really that simple at all. In the broader world, outside economic theory, the word utility can be defined any number of different ways. If you get into the philosophical theory of ethical utilitarianism, you'll find a lot of discussion about how to define utility to make it ethically meaningful and relevant. Not important here, because I want to discuss utility as it's defined and used in economic theory. If I want to say something about utility more generally or refer to a different definition of utility, I'll be sure to mention it. The definition of utility used in economic theory is actually pretty unique. The most interesting and really the defining characteristic is that it precludes what are known as interpersonal utility comparisons, which just means comparing levels or amounts of utility across different people. That just means if we have two people whose desires are inconsistent, so we have a conflict of desires, let's say, for example, both people want something, but there's only enough of whatever it is for one of them to get it, we cannot resolve that conflict by figuring out who would get the most utility. All distributional issues involve this kind of conflict of desires because people in general want things. So the implication of interpersonal utility comparisons being impossible is that we can't use utility to resolve distributional issues. A quick note on terminology. I said desires just then, but in economic theory one often hears some other words that seem roughly similar, including preferences, wants, needs. They could mean slightly different things in everyday language, but they all refer to the same thing in the context of economic theory. There is no hierarchy of desires. They're all at the same level. A need is a want, is a preference, is a desire. How do we know we can't make interpersonal utility comparisons? Well, that's actually an interesting question, because we can interpret the utility used in economic theory in two very different ways. One interpretation is that utility actually exists in some way as someone's subjective perceptions or feelings of happiness or satisfaction. A completely different interpretation is that utility doesn't really exist at all. It's just a word we use to express unrelated ideas and values. Let's look into these two interpretations a little bit. Let's think about the first interpretation, in which utility exists as a subjective feeling of happiness or satisfaction. How do we know we can't make interpersonal utility comparisons under this interpretation? Because we can't observe subjective feelings or perceptions. Let's just run through a few quick examples to make sure we get what we're talking about here. You might think all you need to do to make an interpersonal utility comparison would be to ask the people involved how happy or satisfied would you be if you got whatever it was. That is not accepted as a basis for making interpersonal utility comparisons in economic theory. People might lie to get what they want, but it's more than that. Even if people are being completely honest, we don't know how the subjective feelings of one person relate to the subjective feelings of another person. Let's look at the reported utility numbers two people jotted down and visualize their potential subjective perceptions of happiness. In this case, even though one person ranked his or her happiness as a 7, his or her subjective feelings of happiness were actually less intense than those of someone who ranked his or her own happiness as a 3. We would have the same problem with any observable indication of happiness. You might think, instead of asking them, I'll just see how they behave. Maybe one person jumps around the room in glee, and the other one just gives a sort of a wan smile. Again, that doesn't work, because we have no way of getting to the relationship between outward displays of happiness or satisfaction and internal subjective perceptions. We'd get the same results even if we got all scientific and did a brain scan and looked at the neurons that fire when people are happy. It's also not something we can just infer based on common human experience. We can't say something like, I suppose a very hungry person would get more utility from a ham sandwich than someone who just ate a big meal. The unique, non-observable, subjective quality of utility, as we've been discussing it here, raises an interesting question. Does maximizing utility, under this interpretation of utility, seem like a plausible goal for society? Well, to investigate, let's do a little thought experiment, the way philosophers do. Let's imagine one day we had a dream where we had superpowers. One of our superpowers was that we could empathize with other people so completely we could actually sense their subjective perceptions of happiness, and we could make interpersonal utility comparisons. We would finally be able to really maximize utility. What would that look like? Yeah, that might not be very pretty. One person's subjective perceptions of happiness might be so much greater than everyone else's that maximizing utility in our dream world might imply doing whatever that person wanted. Let's say that person wanted to kill off everyone else in the world. His or her subjective perceptions of happiness or satisfaction from doing that might be greater than the combined subjective perceptions of happiness of everyone else involved. Thank goodness we were only talking about a dream, or I guess in this case, a horrible, horrible nightmare. We don't really have superpowers. We can't really make interpersonal utility comparisons. We can't really maximize utility. That was a close one. But does it matter philosophically? We were saying our goal is to maximize utility, but at the same time, in the back of our minds, we're relieved we can't really maximize utility. We don't honestly think there's anything so special about this type of utility that we'd be willing to kill off nearly everyone in the world to get more of it. So we're really just pretending our goal is to maximize utility. We're not really being intellectually honest about our goals. We could try to fix the statement of our goal to make it more honest and have it more accurately reflect what we're really thinking by saying our goal is to maximize utility, but only under the condition that we can't really maximize utility. But that doesn't really make any sense. We should probably find a different way to express our true goal. If we were trying to construct a serious utilitarian ethical theory that defined utility in such a way that we'd really want to maximize it if we could, we'd apparently have to work on the definition a little bit. How? I don't know. That would be getting into the philosophy of utilitarianism, which is not our topic for today. But if you're asking, here's an idea off the top of my head. If you're familiar with the history of utilitarianism at all, you might remember Jeremy Bentham's famous early formulation of the goal of utilitarianism: the greatest happiness of the greatest number. We've seen how the goal of maximizing utility, as used in economic theory, can be interpreted as addressing the greatest happiness part, but we haven't seen anything relating to the greatest number part. I wonder if Mr. Bentham might feel the goal of maximizing utility, as used in economic theory, is really only one half of a plausible utilitarian theory. But again, we're not doing a class on utilitarianism. All I want to establish here is that if one accepted this particular interpretation of utility, as used in economic theory, as something that actually exists in the form of subjective perceptions or feelings of happiness or satisfaction, nobody would honestly support the goal of maximizing it. Or at the very least, it would be very controversial in an ethical sense. That doesn't mean we should just throw the theory of welfare economics in the trash can. If you recall, we have a second interpretation of utility as used in economic theory to consider. The second interpretation of utility is that it doesn't refer to anything at all. It doesn't exist. There is no utility. It's just a word economists use to express some ideas and values that have nothing to do with utilitarianism at all. Under this second interpretation, when economists propose the goal of maximizing utility, but define it so they can't make interpersonal utility comparisons, what they're really trying to say is they don't want to think or discuss about how to resolve conflicts of desires or distributional issues. All the talk about utility is just there to set up a condition that will ensure they can't address distributional issues. That's perfectly fine. There's no law that says economic theory or economists must delve into distributional issues. It's a little odd, because the distributional function is one of the most important functions of any economic system, and tends to be the most controversial part. Delving into evaluating economic systems without thinking about distributional issues is a little like discussing a recipe for a very complicated dish without mentioning any of the ingredients at all. Obviously, using the word utility in this way is a pretty confusing way to express a simple determination to not discuss distributional issues. However, it does convert the ethically implausible, or at least absurdly controversial goal of maximizing utility under our first interpretation of utility into a relatively uncontroversial statement that economists don't want to discuss distributional issues. So it does have that going for it. Even more confusing, under the second interpretation of utility, even though economists use the word to express a determination to not take up distributional issues in the conflict of desires case, they might use the same word to express some other ideas and values in other contexts. What might they be expressing when they use the word utility in a situation in which there is no conflict of desires or distributional issues, and we don't have to worry about interpersonal utility comparisons? In a single person, no conflict case, economic theory does allow us to infer the relative utility of two or more actions for a given person based on what that person chooses to do. That's called revealed preference in economic terms. What would the value proposition of maximizing utility in this context look like if we took out the arbitrary reference to utility and just said it in plain English? Well, the plain English translation would be something like, if someone wants to do something and it doesn't impinge on what anyone else wants to do in any way, then we should just let that person do whatever it is. That seems mostly innocuous. However, it's not completely innocuous. And philosophically, there's a big difference between something being mostly innocuous and being completely innocuous. Later, we'll bring up some potential issues with this value proposition. That was a long section, and we covered a lot of ground. So let's wind it up. Does all the talk about utility and maximizing utility in economic theory mean it's a form of utilitarianism? No, not really. Economic theory uses the language and framework of utilitarianism, but in a peculiar way that renders it totally implausible, or at least very controversial, if taken literally as a serious attempt to define utility in an ethically relevant way, as something someone would really want to maximize if he or she could. We get a much less controversial and more plausible interpretation if we think of utility as just a word economists use to express some ideas and values totally unrelated to utilitarianism. Specifically, that economists don't want to discuss how to resolve conflicts of desires, including distributional issues. And people should be free to do what they want to do if what they want to do doesn't conflict with what anyone else wants to do. Expressing those value propositions using the word utility is an inherently confusing way to talk about them. And if that's what economists are doing, they should really stop doing it right away. But if they can't manage it for one reason or another, with a bit of work, an educated consumer can make the necessary translations to plain English and carry on from there. What happens if you don't accept the value propositions involved in maximizing utility as defined in economic theory? Well, in that case, you can just toss the theory of welfare economics in the trash. If you don't agree with some of the value inputs, there's no reason to take the conclusions seriously. Of course, if you're not intellectually honest and use language strategically to get what you want, you might profess support for welfare economics even if you don't really agree with the value propositions on which it's based. In that case, it's just a rhetorical tool that helps you get where you want to go. Now, if you are intellectually honest and you conclude welfare economics is bunk, you should always keep in mind that other components of economic theory can still be useful in other ways. Parts of economic theory can be used as a scientific theory for predicting human behavior. We should evaluate that bit according to the normal criteria one would use to evaluate scientific theories, such as how well does the theory predict or explain observable phenomena. This is different from the welfare economic component, because the welfare economic component is at least partially about values. A good deal of economic theory can be expressed mathematically in the form of equations and graphs and so on. We can evaluate the internal logic of those arguments using mathematics. However, again, this is different from the welfare economic component because the welfare economic component is at least partially about values. So how does one evaluate value propositions anyway? Well, that depends on the ethical framework one is using, and I won't get into that here because I'm not doing a talk on ethics. The point I'm trying to make here is that if you don't agree with the value propositions on which a value or ethical theory is based, you're under no obligation to accept the results as meaningful in the ethical sense of going along with the recommendations developed within that theory about what you ought to do. You could look at the theory for academic reasons, or to see if it's logical, or to pass the time of day, or for any other reason, but not as something you would take seriously as a guide to what you should do. Don't get confused by the multiple uses to which economic theory can be put, and start thinking of economic theory as some sort of miracle of philosophy, in which someone looked at some statistical results and discovered a value proposition, or did a bit of math and derived a value proposition out of thin air. That's not how value propositions work. While we're at it, don't get confused because there's a lot of it about, or it's taught at university. Very few, if any, ethical frameworks recommend you accept value propositions because there's a lot of it about. So far, we've discussed only one substantive value proposition serving as an input to economic theory and expressed using the word utility. In the single person, no conflict case, the correct, ethical, socially optimal thing to do would be to let the person do whatever he or she wants to do. We said before that proposition was mostly innocuous, but not completely innocuous. So let's think about the potential issues associated with that proposition. Let's say religion-based ethics makes the most sense to you, and you don't agree that we should just let people do what they want to do, just because what they want to do doesn't conflict with what anyone else wants to do. You think they should do whatever your religion says they should do, and you support intervening to make sure that happens. To you, that seems like the most ethical thing to do. That's fine. Remember, we're not trying to resolve disputes about these types of value issues. We're just trying to improve how we discuss them. So, you don't accept the value proposition we expressed using the word utility in welfare economics. Again, in that case, you can throw the conclusions of welfare economics in the trash. However, we have an even bigger problem going on. This problem actually applies to a lot more people than just people who are drawn to religion-based ethics. It really involves any situation where one person has ethical beliefs or opinions or preferences about what other people should be doing, even when there's no other obvious conflict of desires involved. What happens when even one person derives utility from preferences relating to what other people are doing is that we potentially transform every situation into a sort of conflict of desires. How do we maximize utility in these cases? Should we let the person do what he or she wants to do? Or should we intervene on behalf of the second party to accommodate his or her preferences about what that person should be doing? We don't know, because we can't make interpersonal utility comparisons. We should be indifferent. Or, if you want to talk about it in plain English, instead of using the word utility, Every situation potentially ends up a distributional issue of the sort we said we weren't going to talk about. To maintain the practical significance of the only value proposition we have so far, in what we were calling the one-person no-conflict case, we really need some way to eliminate this class of potential conflicts of desires. But how? There's a lot of people in the world. How do we ensure we don't have one very opinionated person out there who basically renders all real-world situations a multi-person conflict of desires situation? The funny thing is, if we had just talked plainly in the first place, we'd be fine. We could just add a bit of language, and it would be no big deal. The plain English version would go something like, if a person wants to do something, and what that person wants to do doesn't conflict with what other people want to do in any way beyond those other people's ethical assessments or preferences or opinions about what that first person should be doing, then we should let that person do whatever he or she wants to do. But if we're going to express everything in terms of utility, it's not really obvious how we say that. The easiest way to proceed is probably just introduce some sort of ad hoc value proposition that utility associated with what might be called second-party preferences doesn't count. That value proposition is not really expressed anywhere in economic theory, but it does seem to be an implicit value proposition that we need if we're going to get anywhere at all. Just as an aside, the closest explicit value proposition in economic theory is the notion that we have no grounds to dispute someone else's revealed preferences. So, for example, if someone chooses one thing over another, we have no basis to step in and say he or she got it backwards. In economic theory, that proposition is usually expressed using the Latin phrase de gustibus non est disputandum, which means something like matters of taste are not open to dispute. Just a word to the wise. People don't usually switch to Latin to make themselves more easily understood, at least not unless they've found a time machine and have traveled back to ancient Rome. Now, the de gustibus proposition does seem implied by the definition of utility used in economic theory, or alternatively by the value propositions we expressed using the word utility. So I don't think we need to treat that one as an unrelated value proposition we're importing and tacking on to economic theory. However, again, it doesn't really address the problem we were just discussing, which was about people having their own preferences about what other people are doing. If we're going to eliminate that problem, we do need to import and tack on some kind of additional value proposition. This is yet another indication we're not dealing with a serious utilitarian theory. If a proper philosopher were constructing a serious utilitarian ethical theory, he or she would never resort to importing random, unrelated value propositions and tacking them on to make things work out right. It's very important for the evaluation of welfare economics to keep track of value propositions that appear out of nowhere, and this isn't the only one, as we'll see in a little bit, because economic theory is often presented as resting on just the value propositions we talked about using the word utility, which we said are relatively non-controversial under the interpretation of utility in which it doesn't actually exist, and it's just a word we're using to express some unrelated ideas and values. But really, the value propositions that feed into economic theory are not just the ones we've explicitly introduced or expressed using the word utility. It's those plus any other random value propositions we pull in out of nowhere and tack on to make things work out better. We've been discussing how economic theory uses the language and framework of utilitarianism, but can't really be considered a serious or plausible utilitarian ethical theory. So why do economists talk about utility at all? If you think it exists, but you thank your lucky stars you can't observe it, or measure it, or really maximize it, then why talk as though your goal is to maximize utility? Or if you think it doesn't really exist, and it's just a way of talking about unrelated ideas and values, then why talk that way? The charitable interpretation is that historically utilitarianism was popular, and some early economists were sincerely interested in it and took it up, but then tried to redefine utility in a way they found appealing and plausible in terms of their own values, and over time, and not being philosophers, they ended up with an ethically implausible goal without ever realizing it. The cynical interpretation is that historically some utilitarians began questioning the results of market systems, and some economists disagreed, but again, not being philosophers and being unable or maybe unwilling to talk honestly about their own values, they played an underhanded game of adopting or co-opting the language and framework of utilitarianism, but purposefully revising it in a way that would render the utilitarian critique invalid. Perhaps they kept the fake utilitarianism going even after real utilitarianism became less popular and influential, because they found it was rhetorically useful for promoting their own values indirectly while protecting them from criticism and honest debate by waving utility around as a sort of red herring. Doesn't matter for our purposes. The only thing I'm concerned to establish here is that welfare economics talks about utility, but not in a sincere way. It's either presenting a totally implausible or at least absurdly controversial form of utilitarianism, or it's using the word utility to talk about some ideas and values that are less controversial but have nothing really to do with utilitarianism. We should probably discuss one more issue before we move off this question of what is utility. I wasn't sure I even wanted to bring this one up, but if you get into economic theory, you may run into discussions about ordinal and cardinal utility functions, and you may wonder what that distinction has to do with what we've been discussing here. So maybe it's a good idea to say a few words about it. It's also a good example of how the mix of science, mathematics, and value propositions in economic theory can make things a lot more confusing than they need to be. A utility function is simply a way of expressing utility mathematically in an economic model. An ordinal utility function is a utility function that captures only the relative order or ranking of preferences for a given individual. If we're using an ordinal utility function, it wouldn't make sense to talk about how much utility a person gets from some good in absolute terms, because utility would not be defined except in terms of the relative order or ranking of preferences for a given individual. This has more than that is a sensible statement. How much does this have is not a sensible statement. If we're using an ordinal utility function, it wouldn't make sense to even talk about interpersonal utility comparisons because we'd necessarily be talking about utility in absolute terms. Again, utility would not be defined in that situation. It would only be defined in terms of the relative order or ranking of preferences for a given person. In contrast, a cardinal utility function is a utility function that goes beyond the relative order or ranking of preferences for a given individual to get at the absolute level of utility involved. Using a cardinal utility function, it would make sense to talk about utility in absolute terms, even if there was nothing to compare it to. It would also make sense to talk about interpersonal utility comparisons. It wouldn't necessarily imply we could make interpersonal utility comparisons, but at least it would be grammatically correct. In a scientific context, the choice between writing up an economic model using an ordinal utility function or a cardinal utility function is essentially an arbitrary choice, with the understanding the model will be evaluated on a scientific basis in terms of predicting or explaining observable phenomena. In a mathematical context, the choice between writing up an economic model using an ordinal utility function or a cardinal utility function can again be seen as an arbitrary choice, with the understanding the model will eventually be evaluated on a mathematical basis. However, in the context of understanding and evaluating the value propositions associated with welfare economics, discussing ordinal and cardinal utility functions can create a whole lot of confusion, because we then have the underlying concept of utility on the one hand, and the mathematical expression of that utility in a particular model using a particular utility function on the other. So now we have to think about the relationship between the two. Let's think about our first interpretation of utility, in which utility exists as subjective perceptions of happiness. In this case, the relevant concept of utility must be cardinal in nature. It cannot be an ordinal concept, because we can talk about subjective perceptions in absolute terms, even when there's nothing to compare them to. Let's say a world where only one good exists, and that would be impossible if the concept of utility involved were ordinal. However, if we then express that concept of utility in mathematical form using a utility function in a particular economic model, it's not entirely clear whether the characteristics of that mathematical function must reflect the nature of the concept of utility we have in mind. Let's say we have in mind the first interpretation of utility in which it exists, which we just said was a cardinal concept of utility, but we want to investigate what would happen if we looked only at the order of preferences. So we used an ordinal utility function in some particular model. In order to understand and evaluate the value propositions we're expressing in our theory, we would then have to clarify whether we mean the underlying concept of utility or the mathematical expression of that concept of utility that we used in that particular model. That's why the mathematical concepts of ordinal and cardinal are best reserved for discussing the characteristics of mathematical utility functions in scientific and mathematical contexts. When it comes to thinking about the value propositions expressed in the theory of welfare economics itself, we're much better off thinking in terms of the two fundamental interpretations of utility we discussed earlier: the interpretation where utility exists and the interpretation where it doesn't exist. So what does economic theory have to say about distributional issues anyway? All economic theory really says about distributional issues is if we don't have any ethical concerns about distributional issues, that is, about how goods and services are distributed, and we have a so-called perfectly competitive market, then we should get a socially optimal outcome in which utility as defined in economic theory is maximized. Or if you want to leave the word utility out of it and just say it in plain English, an outcome where the value propositions we expressed using the word utility and any other value propositions we pulled in from nowhere have been met. What value propositions are those? Well, just as a reminder, the ones we've talked about so far are as follows. 1. We weren't going to address the issue of how to resolve interpersonal conflicts of desires, including distributional issues. 2. In the single person, no conflict case, we said we should let people do whatever they want to do. 3. We added the implicit value proposition. We weren't going to consider second-party preferences relating to what other people ought to be doing. I guess we need a version of that even if we're using the language about maximizing utility. So in that case, it would be something like utility from second-party preferences doesn't count. 4. We have one more value proposition we'll discuss a little later, because I haven't gotten to that part of the story yet, so I'll just put a placeholder for now. Returning to what economic theory has to say about distributions, what if we do have ethical concerns about the distribution of goods and services? Well, in that case, economic theory has nothing to say about it and is indifferent about addressing or not addressing it, as well as how we address it if we do address it. When properly understood, it's a mostly innocuous theory that doesn't say anything about the controversial distributional component of our economic system, who gets what. If you have the idea, economic theory says something more about distributional issues, what's probably happening is that some other value propositions relating to distributional issues, but not related to economic theory, are being pulled in from somewhere and tacked on. Or there's some sort of confusion going on about what the theory actually says. Here's an example to make it practical. Let's say you see poor people and you see it as an ethical issue on utilitarian grounds, or maybe on fairness grounds because you don't think they're getting their fair share, or on rights grounds because you think they have a right to something they're not getting, or on religious grounds, or really on any other grounds at all. Doesn't matter why. And because of your concerns, you suggest we do something for them using any approach at all. What does economic theory say about that? Nothing. Well, should we do whatever it is or not? Economic theory is indifferent. It expresses no opinion. The reason is that if a policy makes at least one person better off and at least one person worse off, then it's outside the realm of what economic theory can evaluate. The type of utility we're using in economic theory cannot be used to compare outcomes that differ in that way. Or, if you want to talk about it without using the word utility, economists have determined they don't want to discuss how to resolve distributional issues. I could gussy up the language and write down some equations and draw some graphs and so on, but I'm not really interested. Go take a class in microeconomic theory if you want to see how that works. What I'm interested in here is how people get the wrong end of the stick and come to think economic theory has more to say about distributional issues than it does. So let's move on to some of the various ways this can happen. A few moments ago, I mentioned a mystery value proposition I said was imported and tacked onto economic theory, but didn't really involve utility and isn't even really expressed using the word utility. We put a placeholder for this value proposition in an earlier section. I held off discussing this one until now because it enters economic theory at the stage of thinking about the conditions of a perfectly competitive market. So it enters a little later than the other value propositions we discussed. You can find a lot of discussion about the defining features of a perfectly competitive market structure, and I don't really want to get into that here. Some of the issues are pretty interesting. For example, How realistic is it to suppose we could ever produce a perfectly competitive market or maintain one? And how close is close enough? If we're using sloppy, old-fashioned language and talking about the free market, is it plausible to suggest any real market would freely tend toward a perfectly competitive market structure as opposed to some other market structure like oligopoly or monopoly, for example? Or do we need to do a whole lot of regulating to create perfectly competitive markets? I don't want to get into those types of issues here. However, I would like to mention one condition of a perfectly competitive market that is really a condition for any sort of functioning market system at all: the existence of some kind of property rights. Consider this thought experiment. Let's say a man waves a gun at another man and orders him to hand over his wallet. There's a police officer standing by, ready and able to intervene. He wants your opinion, but you want to restrict yourself to only those values we've discussed so far. Do you support the intervention or not? You would be indifferent. In terms of the totally implausible or absurdly controversial interpretation of utility in which utility exists, we can't tell who would get the most utility from the wallet. In terms of the more plausible interpretation, in which utility doesn't exist, we use the word utility to say we weren't going to get into how to resolve these issues. Well, obviously, we can't really have much of a market system in that case. One way to resolve that particular conflict of desires, or distributional issue, is to bring in some type of property right. Let's say in our scenario, the man with the wallet has the property right. So if we accept that property right, we should support intervening so he can keep the wallet. How do we know that maximizes utility? We don't. Or under the interpretation of utility in which it doesn't exist, didn't we just say we didn't want to get into how to resolve these sorts of distributional issues? We did, but we're doing it now. This is another entirely unrelated value judgment we're importing into and tacking on to economic theory. In this case, again, there's no obvious way to even express it using the word utility. This imported value proposition is again mostly innocuous because it doesn't really say anything about the property rights. Because we're not talking about the basis of these property rights, or whether we can change them, and if so, how and why, one could say we're still not really taking up the issue of how to resolve conflicts of desires or distributional issues in any substantive way beyond not accepting spur-of-the-moment resolutions based on physical violence. But again, there's a big difference between mostly innocuous and completely innocuous. Anarchists, in particular, are famous for saying things like, they don't need no stinking laws, including, one must presume, laws relating to property rights. So if you're an anarchist and you're reading economic theory about what is socially optimal, you can basically throw the book in the trash because the conclusions rely on value propositions you don't accept, such as this notion we need property rights to create an orderly market system. Some other people may be in the same general situation. Maybe you're some sort of social Darwinist who's attracted to the idea of the survival of the fittest. The guy with the gun got the drop on the other guy, so maybe he should get the wallet. He's a go-getter. In this case, he went and got someone else's wallet. But these are not common ethical frameworks. Most people would prefer we not settle disputes according to the law of the jungle. However, this proposition can also be rendered not innocuous in a totally different way. Some people have very specific and elaborate rights-based ethical theories to deal with resolving conflicts of desires and distributional issues. And if you're not watching carefully, they can import all that as the property rights required in economic theory to establish any type of market structure at all. Once someone does that, the inability to make interpersonal utility comparisons becomes irrelevant. Or, if you prefer, we totally negate the stated intention of economists to not take up distributional issues. It's fine if you support those value propositions, but it's not economics. I'll discuss some issues relating to rights-based distributional theories in the section on real distributional issues near the end of my talk. A so-called efficient outcome, in the context of economic theory, basically means you're at a perfectly competitive market outcome. The most important thing to realize is there's not just one market outcome that has this quality. If we change the distribution of resources in some way, we'll get a different pattern of demand and supply, and under the conditions of a perfectly competitive market, we'll end up at another market outcome that is also efficient. How will that outcome be different from the one we were just at? Some people will be better off and some worse off. What's going on in economic theory is that economists are trying to separate out the potentially controversial distributional issues on the one hand from what happens when you set up or maintain a perfectly competitive market on the other hand. This attempt to theoretically separate out what happens when you set up or maintain a perfectly competitive market from the distributional issues that would normally be associated with setting up or maintaining a perfectly competitive market in any realistic situation can create a whole boatload of confusion. The first thing to keep in mind is that the relative desirability of efficiency over inefficiency, as those terms are used in economic theory, only applies if we're talking about the same distribution. If we look at two outcomes, one of which is efficient and one inefficient, but they have different distributions, in that at least one person is better off and one person worse off, economic theory cannot compare the desirability of the two. It implies one should be indifferent between the two outcomes. Efficiency is not a global concept. Here's an illustration of what's going on in a non-economic context. Let's say we want to go to New York City for the weekend, but the only means of transportation we can find is an old, broken down, inefficient bus. Someone finds us the most modern, efficient plane to LA. Which transportation option should we choose? The efficient one or the inefficient one? Well, that's a confusing way of asking the question, isn't it? Efficiency and inefficiency are defined relative to a goal. If we're talking about two different goals, as in this case, and only one of the two choices relates to that goal, then that's the one we want to go with, whether it's the more efficient of the two or not. Since we want to go to New York and not LA, if we have only the two choices we just described, we would prefer the inefficient bus to New York over the efficient plane to LA. It's very common to hear arguments along the lines of economic theory shows one shouldn't change anything in our economic system to address perceived distributional issues because that would be inefficient, or would create inefficiencies, or would interfere with the efficiency of the market, and so on. That's not the way efficiency works in economic theory. When you hear someone making that sort of argument, you know that person doesn't know what he or she is talking about. Or he or she does know and is trying to pull a fast one on you. Another line of argument one hears sometimes is that economic theory suggests we oppose addressing distributional issues unless we can address them using certain selected approaches. This is basically a more elaborate version of the efficiency argument we just discussed. In economic models, two common ways to change distributions are to change what we call the initial distribution, which is the distribution in time period 1, when we start the whole model going, or we do what we call a transfer in some later time period, and just shift resources around to end up with a different distribution. Obviously, the idea of changing the initial distribution doesn't really have any counterpart in the real world, because distributions develop over time and don't have a clear starting point. And anyway, we can't go back in time to change them if they did. The idea of whether there is anything in the real world that corresponds to the sort of transfer we commonly encounter in economic models is a bit murkier. What happens if we assume we can do one of these transfers in real life is that it can lead to the notion we don't have to worry about distributions. We can just concentrate on economic efficiency, set up a perfectly competitive market, get to any perfectly competitive market outcome. And then if we see some distributional issues, we can do one of these transfers, and we end up at a different efficient outcome that addresses our concerns without ever diverging from the conditions of a perfectly competitive market. In terms of our New York and LA scenario, it's as if someone said, look, just take the efficient plane to LA. Don't worry about it. Once you're in LA, we'll transfer you to New York. So all you have to worry about is getting the most efficient mode of transportation wherever it's headed. You don't have to worry where it's going at all. That sounds pretty great, right? But clearly, a lot is hinging on this transfer. How exactly are we transferring from LA to New York? Is it even technically feasible? What does it cost? Does it cost more than if I just took the inefficient bus to New York in the first place? So returning to our world of economic theory and economic models, what do we really know about this transfer? Well, all we really know is it's meant to be the best approach for addressing distributional issues because it doesn't involve diverging from the conditions of a perfectly competitive market. Other than that, the details are a little sketchy. Clearly, we have some potential issues on the horizon. One way this concept of a transfer can cause problems is that people may try to import the value proposition that if we can't address distributional concerns in the theoretically best way possible through one of these transfers, then we shouldn't address them at all. That value proposition is clearly not in economic theory. As we explained, in economic theory, if we're at an efficient, perfectly competitive market outcome, and someone argues on distributional grounds we should change something, even if that change is not efficient and diverges from the conditions of a perfectly competitive market, we should be indifferent between those two outcomes. Economic theory does not imply we should prefer staying at the efficient outcome because getting to the other outcome doesn't address distributional concerns in the theoretically best way possible. So we're not talking about economic theory here. We could actually stop right here, because the focus of our talk is economic theory. But since we're here anyway, what about just as an independent value proposition? Is it plausible at all? The proposition in general form would be something like, we should only try to implement our values or ethical beliefs if we can do so in the best, most efficient way possible. Let's think of a hypothetical example. Let's go back to that scenario of the man with the gun and the other man with the wallet. Let's say there's a property right involved, and we support the property right, and the guy with the wallet has the property right, so we think he should retain the wallet. The best, most efficient way of implementing that value proposition would probably be to have a cop standing right there who could nip the problem in the bud. Let's say if we don't arrange for a cop to be standing right there, we could still make it work out the way we wanted, but in a much more awkward and costly way. We could have a security camera that records the incident, track down the guy with the gun, send someone to pick him up, have a court case, retrieve the wallet, and give it back to its rightful owner. What if I propose something like, if we didn't arrange for a cop to be standing right there, then we shouldn't do anything at all? That doesn't sound very plausible, or at least very controversial. Is there any way we can change the proposition to make it more plausible? Well, if we could wave a magic wand and have a cop appear whenever we needed one, then the proposition would probably make sense. Why would we ever support using the cumbersome security camera approach when we could just make a cop appear? To put it in slightly less facetious terms, if the best, most efficient approach for implementing our value propositions were just as available and just as technically feasible and less costly than the other approaches, then maybe we should oppose using those other approaches in favor of using the best approach. At least it wouldn't sound absurd to suggest it. So what's the situation with these transfers? Do we know they're always as available, as technically feasible, and less costly than the other approaches to addressing distributional concerns? I don't think so. It's not entirely clear they even exist at all, if defined as a method for changing a distribution that doesn't involve departing from a perfectly competitive market in any way, or in other words, introducing economic inefficiencies. Some common ways of addressing distributional concerns most of us know about include the following. 1. Manipulating the conditions of the labor market with minimum wage laws, unions, tariffs, trade wars, restrictions on the movement of labor or capital, and that sort of thing. 2. Changing the conditions for passing on resources from one person to another through inheritance laws, for example. 3. Doing some sort of tax and spend program involving either a direct monetary transfer or setting up some sort of program. Do any of these correspond to the sort of transfer we have in mind from the context of economic models? Well, the tax and spend program using direct monetary transfers seems most similar to what we have in mind. So, is that sort of policy consistent with a perfectly competitive market? It's clearly changing relative compensation, and hence changing market incentives in some way. If we're saying, no, that's not really consistent with a perfectly competitive market, then it's not entirely clear what sort of program could ever move resources around to address distributional concerns and not have that feature. So it seems quite likely this transfer we're looking for doesn't actually exist in the real world. In that case, our proposition would basically be saying something like, we shouldn't address distributional issues unless we can find a mythical unicorn and have it arrange everything for us. In other words, it wouldn't be a very serious value proposition. It would basically be the same as saying we should oppose changing anything to address distributional concerns. So, for the sake of argument, let's say yes, tax and spend transfer programs are entirely consistent with what we mean by a perfectly competitive market. Now, we at least have confidence we're talking about something that actually exists. So that seems promising. So can we say these tax and spend transfer programs are always as available, as technically feasible, and less costly than the other potential approaches for addressing distributional issues? I don't know, but I don't think so. It can be politically tricky, expensive, and technically difficult to set up and enforce a tax code that accomplishes what one thinks it should accomplish. It seems very much an empirical issue, whether that sort of program is more or less available, technically feasible, or less costly than other potential approaches to changing distributions. Clearly, people can discuss the best way to address distributional issues. Different sorts of programs may be more or less available, or feasible, or costly. Economists can certainly join in that discussion. However, there's nothing in economic theory that says we should only address distributional issues if we can do so in the theoretically best way possible. Indeed, it's not entirely clear anything in the real world corresponds to what economists have in mind by the theoretically best way possible, which is a policy that addresses distributional concerns without departing from the conditions of a perfectly competitive market. And if there is something corresponding to that policy in the real world, it's not really very obvious how it would stack up to other potential approaches. When you hear people opposing policies that address distributional concerns on the basis that economic theory only supports addressing distributional issues if we use a certain approach, then you know they don't know what they're talking about. Or they do know what they're talking about, and they're trying to pull a fast one. Another common argument is that the implication of being unable or unwilling to address distributional concerns within economic theory is that, from the point of view of economic theory, one should support whatever distribution happens to be in place, or equivalently oppose any effort to change it. So someone says, I have an ethical problem with the distribution, and I want to do something about it, and you oppose it on the grounds there's no rationale for doing that within economic theory. The problem with this argument is it's not really being indifferent with respect to distributional issues. It's what we might call fake indifference. If we're confining ourselves to thinking about utility as defined in economic theory, or about the value propositions we expressed using the word utility, then yes, there's no reason provided within economic theory to change a distribution. However, equally, there's no reason to not change a distribution. Let's go back to our scenario of the man with the gun. Remember, we're thinking only about utility now. If it helps, imagine we're in a world where there are no property rights or any other laws that would be relevant to this situation. A police officer, who in this case would be just another guy with a gun, says, I don't like what I'm seeing here and I'm going to intervene. He asks you for your professional opinion as an economist based on utility as used in economic theory, and you think, well, I can't tell who would get more utility from the wallet. Or, if you prefer, speaking as an economist, I don't want to take up distributional issues. So I say, I'll be neutral and oppose the intervention. But opposing the intervention is not being neutral. There is no practical difference between opposing the intervention on that basis and opposing it because you think the guy with the gun should have the wallet. Being neutral implies indifference. We should be indifferent between the police officer intervening or not intervening. We would have no opinion on the matter. We wouldn't be taking sides and opposing anything. It's not the same thing at all. What's happening in this argument is, again, someone is trying to import and tack on a value proposition that is not based on utility or on anything going on in economic theory. The value proposition in this case is something like, we should oppose anything that would change whatever distribution we have. We should evaluate that value proposition like any other external value proposition having nothing to do with economic theory. Again, everyone has ideas on how to resolve distributional issues, and if you find this one compelling, we can discuss it in the proper philosophical context. I'll tell you right now, it certainly doesn't seem very plausible at first glance, because we're not saying anything about the existing distribution other than it exists. It was there when I got here. Maybe under that distribution, nearly everyone is dying from starvation. Maybe that distribution is the result of criminals stealing everyone's stuff and setting up some bogus system of property rights. It's hard to take seriously the value proposition one should support whatever distribution happens to exist. In contrast to talking about whatever distribution happens to exist, talking about some particular distribution, such as the one that actually exists, is a lot more plausible because it allows us to add some additional ethical reasoning about what we think makes that particular distribution appealing. For example, we could say we support the existing distribution because we think it's the result of a system of property rights we support, and we think the distributional mechanisms in place in terms of labor markets and investment markets and inheritance laws and so on solve all distributional issues in the best, fairest, most ethical way possible. That's fine. That's certainly one way to solve distributional issues. However, again, it's not in economic theory. It's ethical philosophy. Economic theory doesn't really have anything to say about the best way to set up property rights. Also, we can't address distributional mechanisms within economic theory because we can't make interpersonal utility comparisons. Or putting it another way, we said we weren't going to get into discussing distributional issues. So we can't really say anything about the ethical standing of labor markets, investment markets, inheritance laws, or anything else feeding into the existing distributional mechanism. Indeed, this particular proposition is pretty much contrary to the entire agenda of welfare economics, which is to separate out distributional issues, withhold judgment on those, and evaluate perfectly competitive markets without getting into those potentially controversial distributional issues. Our main point here is, again, if you aren't convinced by this particular theory of how best to resolve distributional issues, and some people tell you you need to go study economic theory, then they don't know what they're talking about. Or they do know what they're talking about, and they're trying to pull a fast one. Another argument one hears now and then is that changing the current distribution makes everyone worse off. That's certainly one way to avoid discussing distributional issues. What's the point if everyone is made worse off if we try to change the distribution? Obviously, this result is not in economic theory. To the extent people try to relate this argument to economic theory, it's probably a version of the efficiency argument. If we're at a perfectly competitive market outcome and we change anything to address distributional concerns, then we're introducing inefficiencies. And that certainly sounds as though they must make everyone worse off. We already discussed that's not how the concept of efficiency works in economic theory. It's not a global concept. When we change the distribution, we change the goal in relation to which efficiency is defined. So we're not necessarily losing anything if we go from an efficient outcome under one distribution to even an inefficient outcome under a different distribution. The other way to interpret this proposition is as an empirical claim rather than as a bit of confusion about what economic theory says. That is, we can't establish theoretically that everyone will be worse off if we change the current distribution, but as a practical matter, we think they will be. As an empirical claim, the proposition is quite dubious. Some people making this argument might be thinking about total economic output. They might be thinking, doing anything at all generates costs, and if you're moving resources around and changing incentives, it's always possible some of those incentive effects may be detrimental for economic activity. But of course, there are other things going on as well. For one thing, if you're thinking of spreading resources around a bit, you may end up with a more robust consumer demand, which would actually help the economy grow faster and be less susceptible to economic depressions and recessions. And you may save a bit of money on not having to deal with the social pathologies that might very well be associated with certain distributional patterns. So there's lots of things going on if we wanted to think about total economic output seriously. It's an interesting empirical question. However, for our purposes here, the main point to keep in mind is that any argument about total output is not really relevant for our discussion of whether or not there are distributional issues. Increasing total output is perfectly consistent with some people becoming worse off, if, for example, their share of the output is declining. So you can't really get to a conclusion, like everyone will be worse off, if what you're thinking about is total output. If we don't have that sort of confusion involving total output going on, it should become more obvious that the claim that any attempt to address distributional issues will necessarily make everyone worse off is quite dubious indeed. Most real-world policies have winners and losers. It would be quite a feat to even imagine a policy that literally makes no one better off. Indeed, the fact that real-world policies pretty much always have winners and losers implies all real-world policies involve distributional issues. That's why the involvement of economists in real-world policy discussions can create so much confusion. Really, if economists are bringing in arguments from the theory of welfare economics, they should remain silent or express indifference on any policy involving winners and losers because of the distributional issues involved. That would be most and quite possibly all policy issues. However, it's not uncommon at all to find economists offering up policy advice based on the assumption that one finds the distributional effects of whatever policy is under consideration ethically acceptable. Some economists are very conscientious and careful to state this assumption explicitly whenever they offer up policy advice, but some are not, and the assumption is left implicit. This can easily give the ignorant or the unwary the incorrect impression that the only thing involved in accepting or not accepting policy advice from economists based on the theory of welfare economics is whether one understands economic theory. Put another way, it can easily give people the incorrect impression that economic theory itself establishes that the distributional effects of the policy in question are acceptable, and there are no ethical issues involved. This omnipresent potential for confusion is why you should always keep a very close eye on real-world policy recommendations from economists. If you see ethical or value issues associated with the distributional effects of real-world policies, you can throw any advice from economists based on welfare economics in the old trash can, because advice based on economic theory using concepts such as economic efficiency involves the assumption that one does not see any ethical or value issues associated with those distributional effects. Another misleading argument one sometimes hears is that addressing distributional issues involves making arbitrary value judgments. This argument is a version of the fake indifference argument. When we discussed the fake indifference argument, we pointed out it doesn't really work in the context of economic theory because neutrality with respect to distributional issues implies whatever general criticism you're prepared to level against other distributions and the people who support other distributions must apply equally to any distribution, and the people who support any distribution. For example, in this case, we would be saying equally that someone who supports the existing distribution is making arbitrary or unjustified value judgments. However, it might be worthwhile to think a little more about where this formulation of this error might come from. One likely way this perception might arise is that some economists have tried to explicitly introduce independent value propositions relating to distributional issues by way of something called the social welfare function, which allows one to identify what is ostensibly the single best, efficient, perfectly competitive market outcome from the collection of all such outcomes that differ along the distributional dimension of who gets what. These social welfare functions generally involve adjusting utility for wealth, probably because wealth is one of the few potentially relevant details that tends to show up in economic models. These social welfare functions are another example of people bringing in and tacking on value propositions that are not related to utility as defined in economic theory. On the one hand, this is less confusing than some of the other attempts to introduce external value propositions related to distributional issues we've seen, because in this case, we're making it clear we're introducing these value propositions from outside economic theory for the purpose of addressing distributional concerns, and we're even using the word utility to talk about them. On the other hand, these social welfare functions can create even more confusion than usual, because the value propositions we're bringing in and tacking on are typically based on conventional ethical utilitarianism. So it can create the perception there's something uniquely arbitrary with respect to these particular value propositions because they seem to be saying something about the utility used in economic theory that we can't possibly know because of how that utility is defined, and the restriction on interpersonal utility comparisons, or if you prefer, our determination to not discuss how to resolve distributional issues. And yes, the value propositions we're adding are arbitrary in the context of the utility used in economic theory, but only in the sense that any proposition addressing distributional issues is arbitrary in the context of that type of utility. Recall, all economic systems solve distributional issues one way or another. Economists can choose to talk about them or not, but it's not something we as a society have the luxury of deciding to address or not address. Even if we do nothing and allow anarchy to prevail, these disputes will be solved in some way, probably in that case according to whoever has the biggest gun, but they will be resolved. Goods and services will end up someplace. And everyone has ideas about how to solve these distributional issues ethically. Economists, acting in their official capacity, profess to not want to get into these issues and profess indifference about distributional issues, and that's fine. They're under no obligation to present a comprehensive analysis of economic systems. They can look at one small subset of the issues if they like. However, it means if one brings in some ideas relating to distributional issues and tries to tack them onto economic theory, whatever one brings in will appear arbitrary with respect to economic theory. We finally emerged from the dark forest of potential confusion that surrounds the nexus of distributional issues and economic theory. That wasn't so bad, was it? We've mentioned in passing some things we might consider in serious discussions of distributional issues, but perhaps a quick summary might be helpful. Again, our main point here is that when it comes to thinking about these issues, it's not about economic theory or learning economic theory. Economic theory is fine if there are no distributional issues involved. But if distributional issues are involved, It's nothing but a red herring. One common view on distributional issues we've mentioned a few times is the view that the system of property rights we actually have, combined with the distributional mechanisms we actually have, lead to the most ethical resolution of distributional issues. As one might imagine, it's a fairly common view. Don't mess with what we have. Everything is perfect, just the way it is. One interesting issue here is that this particular perspective on distributional issues is based on process rather than outcomes. So assessing outcomes becomes irrelevant in some way. That perspective is entirely different from those who want to look at the outcomes of markets and judge how well they're working according to some metric of performance. Many people who hold process-based distributional theories probably have some ideas about what they feel should be rewarded on the labor market. For example, hard work. But real labor markets reward all manner of things, like innate abilities and talents, and sometimes even one's appearance, the quality of the education one received as a child before one could do anything about it, the environment in which one grew up, including the level of family support, both in terms of general child care and nutrition and so on, but also in terms of encouraging schoolwork and later financing higher education, and even later in terms of advice and connections for getting a job and so on. So, if we want to discuss our distributional processes seriously, we would want to discuss the role of all the factors that generate labor market outcomes, not just the ones that jump out at us as the most ethically attractive ones. Part of the discussion would be ethical. What do we feel should be rewarded on the labor market? But part must be empirical. How do existing labor markets really work? And what really explains the differences we see in labor market results? Some parts of our existing distributional system don't operate through the labor market at all as far as an individual is concerned, but involve either the investment market or inheritance. There's some ambiguity about whether these distributional mechanisms are implied by a perfectly competitive market, but either way, if one is developing a process-based distributional theory, one should have some idea about what should be rewarded via these mechanisms and what is rewarded. It's very easy to fall into just talking about the labor market and forgetting the other elements that make up our distributional system. For example, if we're all about rewarding individual merit on the labor market, and we're talking about a lazy, irresponsible layabout who inherited a boatload of money, that's a little bit of a disconnect. There are also various events that might be under some degree of control in terms of public policy, but clearly are not under an individual's control, including economic depressions and recessions, inflation, technological change, wars, natural phenomena, and so on that play a role in determining distributions. From the point of view of the individual, we're basically talking about luck. Again, if you're serious about this type of process-based argument, you should really have some theory about how these events fit in. If we're combining distributional mechanisms with property rights, then really we need a theory about what makes the existing system of property rights ethically significant as well. Typically, that would also be a process-based theory, but it wouldn't involve a market process. It would involve some sort of legal or political or religious or possibly some other sort of process. Again, since the ethical significance is ostensibly coming from the process, assessing outcomes would be irrelevant and inappropriate. There are a lot of potential issues to consider once we get into these rights-based theories. Are these rights carved into stone, or can we change them? And if so, on what basis and how? Are they meant to involve so-called natural laws? And if so, what do we mean by a natural law? Literally inherent in nature? Like the law of the jungle? Or in the sense there are some things all successful human societies do, so that's what we should do as well. In that case, how do we define a successful society? And how do we know what worked in the past will work in the future? Are there other types of rights in addition to property rights? Might different rights conflict with one another? And if so, how do we resolve those conflicts? Does participating in the labor market involve any particular right, such as the right to a particular share or any share at all of the output? Do people have a right to be not homeless, to not starve to death, to not become slaves of either the legal or practical variety? Lots of potential rights to talk about once we start down that path. An entirely different perspective on distributional issues comes from utilitarian philosophy. We've already discussed utilitarian issues on and off throughout our discussion, but the big concern in the realm of utilitarianism is basically whether we're getting the most bang for our buck in terms of happy people. Utilitarianism involves any number of issues, many of which we've already discussed. How do you define utility to make it ethically relevant and useful? How do you measure it? How do you add it up across people? The problem of the tyrant with a high capacity for happiness we discussed earlier is really an example of a more general problem in utilitarianism. What happens if what makes one person happy makes someone else unhappy? In economic contexts, this typically appears as the problem of the so-called undeserving poor. What if what makes someone happy is having someone else do all the work? An entirely different perspective again on distributional issues would be religion-based theories. An historical example of this sort of theory in action is that charging interest on a loan was at one time considered contrary to the Christian religion and banned in many European countries. Lots of issues here as well. Religious theories tend to have their own idiosyncratic ways of delving into ethical issues, often involving competing texts or the interpretation of ancient languages and so on. But often there's some role for one's conscience or moral sentiments as well. Resolving disputes between adherents of different religion-based ethical theories is notoriously difficult. And of course, atheists and agnostics may dispute the entire foundation on which these theories are based. There are probably any number of other ethical perspectives and theories one might want to apply to distributional issues. The issues are complicated, and a variety of considerations may appear relevant in different contexts. It can be difficult even for a single individual to construct a complete and coherent theory of how to resolve conflicts of desires and distributional issues. When we add in differences between people and the sorts of ethical frameworks they find plausible, it may seem we could never hope to conclusively resolve these issues. Fortunately, we don't need to conclusively resolve them. We can just muddle through. That's one of the nice things about political democracy. We can debate these things and come to some agreement that hopefully makes most people more or less satisfied with how things are working out. It probably won't be perfect. Most likely no one will be completely satisfied. We won't have as consistent a system as we would if it were based on just one ethical theory. Our system will be liable to change this way and that as voters become more or less interested in different distributional issues and different potential approaches to addressing distributional issues. In a democracy, Thinking about distributional issues can and probably must remain a perpetual work in progress. It can even be fun and interesting to talk about once we clear up some of the confusion that shuts down reasonable discussion and makes people get frustrated and angry, and we get past the notion there are simple answers to these questions that only the most remarkable of nitwits could fail to comprehend. We finally reached the end of our little talk. Let's just summarize what we went over and call it a day. Properly considered economic theory doesn't have anything to say about distributional issues, and that result is foreordained by the concept of utility used in economic theory, or to put it another way, by the ideas and values we expressed using the word utility. Economists could make this all a lot clearer if they either came up with a serious definition of utility one would sincerely want to maximize, or if they expressed their unrelated ideas and values in some other way without mentioning the word utility at all. However, economic theory is sometimes incorrectly presented as saying something about distributional issues. In those cases, one thing that might be happening is that other value propositions not developed using the type of utility used in economic theory, and often not even expressed using the word utility, are being introduced surreptitiously, one way or another, and tacked onto the official content, and those value propositions are then incorrectly attributed to economic theory. In the case of these external value propositions that are imported into and tacked onto economic theory, there is no benefit at all to discussing them in the context of economic theory. They can be hard to identify. They're often expressed in funny ways rather than in the most appropriate or relevant terms. And most importantly, they're not defended or developed within economic theory. It's much better to take them out and discuss them in the context of ethical philosophy. The other thing that might be happening is that economic theory itself is being misinterpreted in some way that makes it appear to say something it really doesn't say. If you have some ideas about distributional issues and you support some policy that would address your concerns, but that represents a departure from the conditions of a perfectly competitive market, for example, let's say you're concerned about poor people and you support policies that would help them claim a greater share of the output of our economic system, including policies that are clearly not consistent with a perfectly competitive market. And some people say something to you like, you need to learn more about economic theory. And then you'd understand why your policy suggestions would be inefficient, or create inefficiencies, or interfere with the optimality of the free market, or distort input markets, or make everyone worse off, or why your distributional concerns are arbitrary, or misguided, or not socially optimal, or why your suggested approaches to addressing distributional issues are not acceptable approaches, or really anything at all that suggests anything other than complete indifference, then you can rest assured they don't know what they're talking about. Or they do know what they're talking about, and they're trying to pull a fast one. You should know enough about how economic theory works to not waste your time on false and misleading arguments, and instead move directly on to discuss the real distributional issues in their proper contexts, ethical philosophy, and empirical observation. I hope this talk has given you the means and the confidence to do that. Goodbye, everybody.